Guys, if you want to become a better chess player, then there are some general principles and guidelines that can really help you in your games. These are the basic rules and ideas which work 90% of the times. In today's chess video, I'll show you the top 50 chess principles to play smarter moves and eventually win more games. Before we begin, I would like to thank BetterHelp for sponsoring this video. Alright, principle number 1, control the center. This is probably the most common principle of chess. See, these four central squares are very important as they allow more mobility of your pieces. Therefore, you always have a better chance of winning if you grab the center immediately rather than someone who's just making a lot of moves on the side. Principle number 2, develop quickly. Development in chess is nothing but bringing your pieces into better positions like we've done here for the knights and the bishops. By doing this, you have a better chance of attacking and winning the game. So that's again a good principle to follow. Principle number 3, avoid unnecessary pawn moves in the opening. Generally speaking, you must not make random pawn moves like these, especially in the opening. You simply waste a move and this allows your opponent additional time to develop his pieces and gain central control. So this is something you want to avoid. Principle number 4, if possible, develop with tempo. It's always a good idea to develop with tempo, which means you not only improve the positioning of your pieces, but also attack the opponent with the same move. Threatening the opponent's pieces will force him to take defensive action rather than continuing his own development. So try to develop your pieces with tempo. Principle number 5, knights before bishops. When developing your pieces, it's generally better to bring out your knights before the bishops because the knights generally occupy these two squares in the opening, so it's quite straightforward. Whereas the bishops have a lot more options along these diagonals. Therefore, it's better to position them later depending on how you want to play the game. So develop the knights before the bishops. Principle number 6, don't move the same piece twice in the opening. Look, if you keep moving the same piece again and again, you're just wasting time. All your other pieces are stuck on the back rank and your opponent gets a huge lead in development. So that's something you definitely want to avoid. Principle number 7, avoid bringing out the queen too early. Since the queen is the strongest piece on the board, if you bring it out too soon, say something like this, it can easily be attacked by the opposing pieces. So what happens is you just keep moving your queen here and there and your opponent gets a big lead in development and you end up in a bad position. So don't bring out your queen too early. Principle number 8, castle quickly. It's generally advisable to castle as early as possible because your king is safe behind these pawns. And that's much better than being stuck in the middle where your opponent can attack your king. So castle as soon as possible. Principle number 9, avoid moving pawns in front of your castled king. Once you've castled, these pawns become very important because they keep your king safe. If you move them, you create these weaknesses which can easily be exploited by your opponent. So avoid moving these pawns unless you have a good reason. Principle number 10. Don't open the center if your king is not castled. If your king is stuck in the center of the board, it's generally not a good idea to open up the center. Say for example, if you play d4, pawn takes, knight takes, and rook e8 puts a lot of pressure on your king. This is something you want to avoid, so it's better you castle first and then play d4. Guys, we've covered 10 principles, and if you've enjoyed the video so far, please don't forget to hit the like button below this video right now. Principle number 11, connect your rooks. Now once you've developed your pieces and castled, it's generally a good idea to connect your rooks. This way, they can protect each other and then you can also position them on any of these files to easily attack your opponent. So connecting your rooks is a good idea. Principle number 12. Place your rooks on open or semi-open files. In this position, the E file is an open file because it has no pawns. So a move like rook to E1 is quite good because it unleashes the rook along this open file. A semi-open file is the one which has only one colored pawn. For example, here the D file is a semi-open file because it only has a black pawn and not a white pawn. So even a move like rook to d1 makes sense because it takes control of the semi-open file. So you should try to place your rooks on open or semi-open files. Principle number 13. Position your rooks on the 7th rank. A rook on the 7th rank is typically very powerful. In this position, rook to b7 is a fantastic move because it makes this rook extremely dangerous. It threatens all these pawns and ties down the enemy king. So try to get your rooks on the opponent's 7th rank. By the way, for black, this 2nd rank is actually the 7th rank, so try to get them there. Principle number 14. Doubled rooks on an open file are very strong. In this position, white already has control over the D file with one of his rooks, but he can extend his dominance even further by getting in his other rook as well. Now it becomes very difficult for black to gain control of this file because of these doubled rooks, so try to double up your rooks on open files. Principle number 15. Don't sacrifice without a good reason. If you're sacrificing material, make sure you have adequate compensation. I've seen many players randomly sacrificing on f7 with the hope that they will expose and demolish the opponent's king, but usually that doesn't work. After a few checks, their attack just fizzles out and it's difficult to make progress. So if you sacrifice for an initiative, make sure that the initiative is enduring. You must always have a good reason before sacrificing your pieces. Principle number 16. Prioritize forcing moves. As the name suggests, forcing moves force your opponent into making a particular move. Specifically, these are checks, captures, and threats. Such moves limit your opponent's responses and therefore they are easy to calculate. In this example, black captured this pawn. Now it is white's turn and I want you to look for forcing moves. Try to find checks, captures, and threats. So a brilliant move here is bishop f7 check. If he takes, you have knight to g5, which finishes off the queen. And even if he doesn't take, you simply continue with your forcing moves. First we threaten with the rook, then we have a check, again threaten the queen, then a check with the knight this time, check with the queen, we bring in the pawn as well, and eventually that's a beautiful checkmate. That's how you can use forcing moves to punish your opponent, so always look out for such moves. Principle number 17. Knights on the rim are grim. Knights are most effective when they are placed towards the center of the board rather than on the side of the board. In this case, white's knights are much more lethal because they control 8 squares each, whereas black's knights on the side control only 4 squares. So avoid moving your knights to the side. Principle number 18. Avoid trading your bishop for a knight. Even though bishops and knights are worth 3 points, it's generally not a good idea to give up your bishop for a knight. Bishops tend to be slightly better than knights in most cases, so don't trade them unless you have a good reason to do so. Principle number 19. Capture towards the center of the board. When you have an option to capture a piece with 2 different pawns, it's generally better to capture towards the center of the board. In this case, after black captures, you can take with either of these pawns. If you take with this pawn, you're moving away from the center. So capturing with the A pawn is considered better because you're capturing towards the center. Principle number 20. Centralize your king during the endgame. In an endgame like this, the king no longer needs to hide behind the pawns. You need to centralize your king and use it more like an aggressive option to win the game. Push him forward, make it more active and try to grab all these pawns. That's how you dominate endgames. Alright, we have many more important principles to discuss, but before that, I would like to thank BetterHelp for sponsoring this video. Guys, just like an intense chess game, life can also be very stressful. Whenever I am in a stressful or anxious situation, I try to distract myself. But most of the times your thoughts are not in your control. That's when you need the help of a professional therapist who can take care of your mental health. Finding the right therapist can be a daunting experience, but BetterHelp makes it very easy for you. Well, BetterHelp is an amazing online platform where you can seek therapy at your own convenience. It's online, it's remote, and just by answering a few questions, you get matched to a suitable professional therapist. The best part is that if you don't really get along with that therapist, you can even switch to a new one at no additional cost. So basically, BetterHelp wants to make therapy more affordable and more accessible so that you can start living a happy and healthy life. It's really easy to sign up. All you need to do is go to this link, betterhelp.com/chesstalk. That's better, HELP. And using this link, you'll get 10% off on your first month. Link is in the description box below, so do check it out. Alright, back to our video. Principle number 21, avoid doubled pawns. Now here, if you recapture with the pawn, it's not such a great move because you've created these weak doubled pawns. That's a big problem because this guy is now blocked. And also both these pawns cannot defend each other going forward, so they are easy to target. Therefore, avoid creating doubled pawns. Principle number 22. Avoid isolated pawns. Isolated pawns are the ones which do not have any pawns on their adjacent files. This H pawn here is an isolated pawn because there are no pawns on the G file to support it. Similarly, both these pawns are double isolated pawns because there are no other pawns on either side of them. That makes them very weak, so this is something you definitely want to avoid. Principle number 23. Avoid backward pawns. Now in this case, if you play c4, you've created this backward pawn on d3. We call this a backward pawn because all the pawns on its adjacent files have been pushed forward. This makes it an easy target since there is no other pawn to defend it. So avoid creating backward pawns. Principle number 24. Create protected passed pawns. A passed pawn is the one that has advanced beyond all its opposing pawns. You must always try to create passed pawns that are protected by your own pawns. For example, after black plays c5, instead of taking any of these pawns, a great move would be to just push it forward so that it creates a passed pawn. We call this a passed pawn because there are no opposing pawns in front of it or on its adjacent files that can stop it from being promoted. Not only this, It is also a protected passed pawn because it is defended by another pawn. This makes it extremely dangerous because it cannot be captured easily, and even if it stays here, it controls these very important squares in your opponent's territory. So always look out for opportunities to create passed pawns. Principle number 25. Position your rooks behind passed pawns. In this position, you have a passed pawn on c5 since there are no opposing pawns in its way. In order to dominate this position, a really good strategy would be to place your rooks behind this passed pawn so that it always stays protected and you can continue advancing forward. This is much better than going this way because you just control one square and it would be very difficult to defend, especially if your opponent goes behind it. So remember to place your rooks behind passed pawns. Principle number 26. Knights are better in closed positions. Now this is clearly a closed position since all these pawns are locked. In such positions, knights are way more powerful than the bishops because they can keep jumping around like this, whereas the bishops can't do much. So preserve your knights in closed positions. Principle number 27. Bishops are better in open positions. Now in the same game, if you did not have all these pawns in the middle, this is an open position. And bishops dominate open positions. See how after bishop f4, all these squares are covered and the knight is helpless. Not only this, knights are slow pieces. They take some time to reach a far off square, whereas bishops can move from one corner to another in a single move. So in open games, bishops are way more powerful than the knights. Principle number 28. Place your pawns on the opposite color square as your bishop. In this game, if you look at both these bishops, which one do you think is more powerful? Obviously, the black bishop is much better because it is placed beautifully along these open diagonals. The bishop is on a dark square and almost all its pawns are on the light squares. On the other side, if you look at the white bishop, it is completely handicapped because most of its own pawns are on the dark squares. The bishop is blocked behind these pawns and it can't do much. So generally, it's a good practice to place your pawns on the opposite color square as your bishop. Principle number 29. Exchange your passive pieces for your opponent's active pieces. Looking at the same example, we now know that this black bishop is much better than the white bishop. So a good idea for white would be to somehow trade off these bishops. A move like bishop b4 is great because you force him to exchange one of his active pieces to get rid of your passive piece. You can now improve your pieces even further by placing a rook on c7 and then going after these pawns. So making such smart exchanges is always a great idea. Principle number 30. Improve your least active piece. Now many times it is not possible to immediately exchange your passive pieces. In such positions, if you are struggling to come up with a move, a good idea in general is to improve your least active piece. Look at all these pieces of white. Which one do you think is the least active? The knights and the bishops are doing fine. They are close to the center. This rook is also on a semi-open file, which is good. This rook seems the least active, so a good move here would be rook to d1 since rooks perform their best on open files. So that's how you can find good moves, especially when you don't have a concrete plan. Principle number 31. Avoid pointless exchanges. In this next example, you'll see that white has these two options to exchange pieces, but none of them are great. If you exchange the pawns, you simply allow black to develop his bishop. And if you exchange the bishop for the knight, then you allow his queen to develop. Usually, you should avoid making such pointless exchanges, especially when you have other better moves like knight to f3. Remember the golden rule, to take is a mistake. Of course, this doesn't mean that you should never make any exchanges. It's just that you should avoid making such equal trades that improve your opponent's position. Principle number 32. Trade pieces if your position is cramped. In this position, white is struggling for space. Both his bishops are stuck and there is not much he can do. So a good option in such positions is to trade off some of your pieces to gain some space. Like here, he can exchange his knight for the bishop. Then he can also trade off the light squared bishops. And after the knight moves away, this opens up the position for white, which is much better to play with. Principle number 33. When you are ahead in material, trade pieces but not pawns. In general, it's a good idea to trade pieces when you are ahead in material and not trade the pawns. Let's look at this example. In this position, white is up the exchange since he has a rook for the knight. So as per our rule, white should look to trade off the pieces. Exchange these queens, exchange one of the rooks, and then eventually when he's left with a rook versus knight endgame, then he can easily use his rook to capture all these pawns. And having a pawn majority in the endgame can be really decisive because white can promote one of his pawns to a queen. On the other hand, if he exchanges the pawns first, then he'll be only left with the pieces, and even after the pieces are exchanged, it becomes really difficult to win a rook versus knight endgame. So you need to keep the pawns when you are ahead in material. Principle number 34. When down in material, trade pawns but not pieces. Same as the earlier principle, if you were to play as black, since black is down in material, the rule of thumb is to trade pawns but not the pieces. If he manages to exchange all these pawns, black will most likely save the game because the drawing margin of pawnless endgames is much higher. So try to trade off the pawns when you're down in material. Principle number 35. Counter-attack the center to deal with a flank attack. Many times in your games, you'll find players who try to attack on one side of the board by pushing these pawns. We call this a flank attack. The best way to deal with this is to counter-attack and open up the center. This is a great strategy to pressurize your opponent, especially if his king is stuck in the middle. Principle number 36. Attack the base of a pawn chain. In positions like these, where your opponent has a really long pawn chain, it's generally a good idea to attack the base of the chain because that is the only pawn which is undefended. Rest all of them are protected by the other pawns. So a good move here would be bishop to b8 or even knight to b5, where we attack this a7 pawn. Principle number 37. Knights are the best at blocking pawns. In this position, black has a passed pawn which is defended by the rook. He's trying to push it forward. Now, one of the best options for white to stop it from moving would be to block it with the knight. Knights are usually the best blockaders for pawns because they can jump over pieces and control many squares even if they stay in the same position. So this is a good way to use your knights. Principle number 38. Identify weak squares to punish your opponent. So what is a weak square? Well, those squares that cannot be defended by any pawn are called the weak squares. In this case, these two squares cannot be defended by any of black's pawns. Why? Because both these adjacent pawns have already moved forward. They cannot go back. Hence, these two squares are his weaknesses. Principle number 39. Occupy weak squares with your minor pieces. Now, once you've identified these weak squares, the next principle is to occupy them with your minor pieces and not the pawns. So for these two squares, try to occupy it with your minor pieces like the knights or the bishops. For example, here you can easily play knight to d5, and that's a really good move because it cannot be threatened by any of these pawns. Principle number 40. Get your knights to outposts. Looking at the same example, an outpost is a square which is on the opponent's side of the board. It is protected by your pawn and which cannot be attacked by your opponent's pawn. So this is an ideal outpost for the knight. Principle number 41. Challenge the weak squares. So after knight d5, what can you play as black? The knight is very powerful on this square, so we need to get rid of it somehow. Therefore, black can challenge it with a move like knight to e7. If he exchanges, that's a really good trade for black. Therefore, a better move for white is to bring out his other knight. If black takes, then again you occupy the outpost with your knight. If he challenges you one more time, you can defend with the bishop. After takes, you occupy the weak square with another minor piece, and this time it's the bishop. So that's how you can apply all these principles that we just discussed. Principle number 42. Evaluate every pawn move. Pawn moves are committal moves because they cannot go backwards. With every pawn move, although you take control of a new square, at the same time you also release control of a few squares. This creates weaknesses in your position. So for every pawn move, you have to make a choice as to which squares are more important. The ones that you have let go or the ones which you want to take control of. This is a very important decision you have to make. For example, here, black played pawn to g6. Now you tell me, is this a good move? I want to hear from you in the comments. Let's see how you apply these principles. Principle number 43. Look for stalemate possibilities. I've seen many players resigning and leaving the game when they feel their opponent is in a winning position. But you should keep fighting till the last moment. And don't lose hope. Even if you cannot win, there are always opportunities to pull off a draw by stalemate. For example, in this position, white gives a check. He blocks with the queen. And even though black is way ahead in material, there is an absolutely brilliant move here for white to pull off a draw by stalemate. Can you find it? Let me know in the comments. Principle number 44. The principle of two weaknesses. In a normal game of chess, we look for a weakness in the opponent's camp and then try to exploit it in the best possible way. However, creating one weakness is usually not enough. Your opponent will simply divert all his resources to his defense. That's where the principle of two weaknesses comes in. If you create a second weakness or multiple weaknesses, then your opponent will not know from where you will attack and it becomes very difficult for him to defend. Look at this example. Black has these two weaknesses on different sides of the board. Almost all his pieces are occupied in their defense. So if you strike one more blow, his position will collapse. So a good move here would be to go after this pawn. He tries to add another defender, but it doesn't work. He can't take because the bishop is hanging, and that's how you can break through. You attack the knight, he moves away, and you pick up the other pawn as well. This is how rapidly his position can deteriorate if you create multiple weaknesses. Principle number 45. Two minor pieces are better than a rook and a pawn. Generally speaking, it's not a good idea to exchange two minor pieces for a rook and a pawn. They both add up to 6 points, but if you trade them without good reasons, it's not that great because they are generally much stronger than a rook and a pawn. Principle number 46. Three minor pieces are better than a queen. In most cases, three well-coordinated minor pieces usually outperform the queen. So if you get an opportunity to pick up three minor pieces for your queen, it's generally good to go for it. Principle number 47. Three pawns versus a minor piece. In situations with three healthy pawns versus a minor piece, the minor piece is usually superior in a middle game like this. But when we look at the end game, the three pawns usually come out on top, especially in such positions where they are pushing so strongly towards a promotion. So if you're trading off a minor piece against three pawns, do keep this in mind. Principle number 48. Attack easy targets. In order to push your opponent on the defensive, a smart strategy is to attack easy targets. Now, what do I mean by easy targets? Look, easy targets are the major weaknesses in your opponent's position. You can attack pinned pieces, you can attack weak pawns, you can go after the exposed king. These are the kinds of weaknesses you can exploit. For example, in this position, the black king is exposed. Not only this, we can target the knight as well with a brilliant move like queen to c3. This knight is now pinned. It's like a situational pin. Black cannot move it because if he does, then queen g7 is a checkmate. So this is how you should be relentlessly attacking easy targets to dominate your opponent. Principle number 49. Follow prophylactic thinking. When you're thinking in a game of chess, there are two ways of looking at it. First is your plans, your threats, your ideas, what you want to do. But the second aspect is also very important, and that is all about what your opponent wants to do. What are his plans? Prophylactic thinking means that you think from your opponent's point of view and try to prevent what he's planning. For example, in this position, black plays bishop c7. The first question you should be asking yourself is, why did he play this? What does he want to do? Well, most likely he wants to get his queen here, go after this pawn and then target our king. So now that you already know his plan, it's a good idea to play something like g3 in order to prevent what he wants to do. This is a really great way of neutralizing your opponent's plans to gain a psychological edge over him. Principle number 50. Practice makes a man perfect. Guys, seriously, if you want to become a better chess player, you have to play the game, you need to practice, you need to implement all these principles in your games, you need to learn from your mistakes. The problem with most of us is that we just keep thinking, we just keep talking, I want to do this, I want to do that, but we never really do it. And that's why we don't get better. And this applies to everything in life, not only chess. Anyway, guys, hope you enjoyed this video. Do subscribe to the channel and I shall see you in the next one.